And more on Stuart's report online, of course. Do check that out, skynews.com. Now, Russia has accused Ukraine of trying to assassinate Vladimir Putin in a drone attack on the Kremlin, an allegation Kyiv has denied. It's spawned conspiracy theories about who did it, even whether Russia could have carried out the attack themselves. What does the former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir Simon Mayall, think? Sir Simon, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Okay. Good morning.
Who do you think might be responsible?
You've come up with perfectly plausible conspiracy theories that either side could have done it. The balance of expectation, I would have thought, is that it benefits Putin at this stage. The war's going very badly in Ukraine, particularly on the military side. The Ukrainians, of course, are about to launch some form of counter-offensive, in the capitals of Europe, or in Washington, NATO. They'll know more about that. And of course, Putin's got to stand on the, outside the Kremlin next Tuesday with a victory parade going on. Equally, he may want to do another mobilisation, but it's a sort of admission of weakness in order to generate, I suspect, a narrative that allows him to up the ante in Ukraine.
Yeah, I wonder if you could explain that in a bit more detail about what's in it for both sides. What are the positives and negatives for both sides?
Yeah, well, I don't see much upside for Zelensky, other than, it's great for morale if you're in Kyiv or you're in the Ukrainian armed forces, to see the sort of, the heart of the evil empire, as they would see it, quite rightly and justifiably, being attacked. But for Zelensky, who's played a very, very tough set of cards extremely well in terms of keeping Western support, I don't think the Americans or the NATO allies would particularly wish to be associated with the Ukraine attacking the Kremlin, the heart of Moscow. So although I can see that being a short-term morale booster for the Ukrainians, I think the long-term strategically would be too bad. But for Putin, I think, with, as I say, the war going badly, a counter-offensive coming, the feeling that you need to say to the Russian people why we continue to need to make this sacrifice, look at these terrorists, they're trying to attack me personally, I need to, turn this into an even greater national effort to kill Zelensky, crush the Ukrainians, denazify. It feeds into that sort of narrative, and that seems more plausible to me than the benefits that Zelensky could do in operating that. And the Russians have form on this, without doubt. They've tried wolf often, and it was one of the reasons they were able to launch the offensive in Chechnya. They staged a series of bomb attacks across Moscow, whipped everybody up into some sort of frenzy that the Chechens were responsible, and then used that to launch their offensive way back in Putin's time.
Suggestions that President Zelensky could be more vulnerable as a result. I went to interview him earlier on in the year, and we talked then about the fact that there are attempts on his life all the time. Absolutely,
and you'll remember, Kay, the original Russian plan was to capture or kill Zelensky in the first 72 hours of the invasion of Ukraine.
And they nearly did.
And they nearly did. And of course, if things had gone well for them, they would have, without doubt. And failing to kill Zelensky then was really a major blow in terms of allowing people to rally around Ukraine and for the West to see there was a spokesman and a leader there. So I don't think they have remotely given up the idea that they might wish to kill Zelensky. And giving themselves an excuse to say, well, you had an attack on Putin, even though it was, it was an attack on the roof of the Senate, and Putin wasn't even there.
Yeah. I mean, the kill team's just a few hundred metres away from Zelensky at the start.
But you will be, on Tuesday.
Security bristles around him now.
Well, he just sort of, it's also a bit humiliating for the Russians, who are supposed to have the most sophisticated air defence system around the Kremlin, to have an attack on the seat of Russian power. So you'll be reporting on, no doubt, the Russian victory parade on Tuesday.
We will.
So it'll be interesting to see the context where we've got to on that, and what the Russians have done over the weekend. And of course, at a certain stage, the Ukrainians will launch the counteroffensive.
Which takes me on to my next question. Where do you think we are with that? The ambassador sat where you are, to the UK from Ukraine, sat where you are earlier on in the week, and he was saying, we're not going to tell you, obviously. Of course they're not going to tell us. But he did say they've got 98% of the hardware that they have been promised from the West.
Yes, and they've been training very hard, and they're fast learners. As you say, they're re-equipped. It is a war of materiel. Even Zelensky, and I think anybody says we're not as, I won't say well-equipped as the Russians, but in terms of depth of materiel, particularly artillery ammunition, they probably know they have limitations. But their tails are definitely up. one would have thought if you were a Russian soldier dug in somewhere, you'd be getting very nervous. So it will be an issue of morale and a battle of wills, as wars always are. And as I've said to a number of people, history is littered with the Russian military collapsing, leading to major political change in Russia. And that would be the worry. But it could be a bit of a one-shot effort from the Ukrainians. So it needs to succeed. For Zelensky to keep NATO and the Americans and the West and public opinion behind Ukraine's efforts and not try and force them into a negotiated solution, they will want to launch this offensive, and it needs to be successful. Not necessarily to throw the Russians out of the Donbass or the Crimea, but set the conditions where it's quite clearly that the Russians are on the back foot and they have very little more to gain by continuing to invest in this war.
I was speaking to one of your former colleagues yesterday and said to him that wars, history would tell us, are often won in the air. He disagreed because he was a soldier. But, they do want fighter jets from the West. As it stands, we're not sending them.
Yes, and people have sort of looked at where they set the bar of Western support to the Ukraine. Some people say artificially, given it is a war. There's no doubt about it, if you are on the ground, air power sets the conditions for your success or defends you, it gives you room to manoeuvre. And that's undoubtedly what the Ukrainians need. They need to have a lot of deception. They need to hit the Russians where they're weak. And they need the capacity to support that manoeuvre by owning the airspace. So the lack of an air force or the lack of an air capability is significant for the Ukrainians. It's not something you can deliver fast. I think that point was made last year. Tanks are easier, artillery easier, ground manoeuvre easier. To train people up to fly a jet they haven't flown on before, it's not the flying, it's the integration of the weapons system, so important, would not make any difference in the time frame we're talking about this offensive, unless NATO air power itself has been used.
But just a quick thought on that before I let you go, Sir Simon, if I may. I mean, I was reading at the weekend that the Ukrainian Air Force fighter jets are intact because they were taken out of the country just before the war started. So why can't they be used?
Well, I suppose they could. I would not be qualified to answer that question, but I do remember the Iraqi Air Force left Iraq before the first Gulf War, disappeared into Iran, was never seen again. I'd be very surprised if it's sitting outside. I know they've had attrition. They've been in air combat. They've had aircraft destroyed on the ground in the early stages. I suspect, I can only assume, the issue is spare parts and munitions, trained fighter pilots as well. But that's not my area of expertise.
Well, you've shared lots of other expertise with us this morning, for which we are eternally grateful. So, Simon, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.